Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides continuous cloud application security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, giving customers deep visibility, risk evaluation with context, and actionable remediation insights to secure their entire inventory of cloud assets. Visit panoptica.app to learn more.
Packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer JJ Manella here with Drew Conry Murray. We have an awesome theme today on resilience. But first, I wanted to just send a quick thank you note. So I posted this on social media and realized that I kept forgetting to mention it, but we had something like over 50,000 downloads last month in June from this podcast, and big hearts. Thank you guys for listening. That really warms my heart and my soul. And we love the feedback. So packetpushers.net/FU so that we can keep giving you lots of entertainment and content that's meaningful for your jobs.
Yeah, it's nice to know we're not just talking into the void. We do appreciate the fact that people are listening, and we do take feedback seriously.
Yeah. Now, Drew and I entertain ourselves pretty well. So if you weren't listening, we would still keep doing this probably. But the fact that you're listening makes it that much juicier for us. So speaking of, talking about themes and things going on that relate to our jobs, we've definitely probably all around the world, Hall and Australia included, are dealing with, some of the fallout of some of the recent CrowdStrike and Microsoft stuff that we're going to get into. And it really kind of begged the question of, let's talk about resilience. Operational resilience, technological resilience, and security resilience. And so nice little bow on that topic for us today. But Drew, why don't you walk us through the big debacle we've had just recently?
Yeah, so by now you've probably heard that CrowdStrike and Microsoft had some issues. CrowdStrike update to Microsoft essentially caused blue screens of death or BSODs around the world. Airlines had problems, hospitals, healthcare systems had problems, 911 organizations had problems, and it was a global issue. Computers essentially shut down, went into a permanent loop. A lot of the fixes had to be manual. CrowdStrike sort of owned up to the problem and released a patch as quickly as they could, or an updated file as quickly as they could. Microsoft hasn't said much regarding the issue, but there's been a lot of talk about how can one software update just obliterate businesses all over the world, and that is why we're going to be talking about resiliency.
And the one update thing, I was really curious about this because what struck me now, I mean, you guys listening, I'm not a platform or an application or a developer specialist. I'm a networking person.
Yep.
So there's a lot of just how this other stuff works that I just don't know. But when I saw this, I mean, obviously I've worked in technology for forever. We've gone through, patches and bugs and blue screens of death galore over the years. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting was the timing of this, that it kind of pushed out so quickly. You know what I mean? It hit a lot of organizations basically. So in other parts of the world that were already kind of going in the middle of our night, stuff was already happening because people were logged in and doing things, and they realized this stuff was broken. And so I was kind of wondering, well, how did something get pushed over that broad of a population so quickly? So I kind of poked into that a little bit. And I assumed the update was like an application update. And that it was why I was confused as why it hit so many people at one time, because not that many people, there weren't 8.5 million people in the world updating, CrowdStrike at that exact moment in time.
Right.
So apparently it was, and I'm probably going to get some words wrong here, so sorry guys, packetpushers.net/FU and correct me later, or come on into the Slack and talk us through it. But apparently, because the endpoint security, the EDR solutions, antivirus, whatever, have hooks into Windows kernels, this was actually the equivalent of a signature update.
Mm-hmm. That's my understanding as well, yes.
For malicious activity that somehow had some type of interaction with the way that CrowdStrike was plugged into the Windows kernel. And so the fact that this was just a signature update, now I'm wondering, and again, I try not to be judgy. I give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, oh, well, maybe this or maybe that, or this could happen to anybody. How the heck do you roll something out like that breaks every freaking Windows machine on the face of the planet, and you didn't know? You didn't do any kind of testing?
One of the major questions I have, and I guess the CEO, George Kurtz of CrowdStrike, will probably be showing up on Capitol Hill to hear from our elected representatives and try to provide some explanation on what went wrong. But yes, was it a lack of testing on CrowdStrike's part, or is there also something in Microsoft's design that made it susceptible to an update in the kernel, just causing the computer to completely crash. And I'm guessing it's probably a little bit of both, but again, don't have all the details yet.
So, lots of chatter happening in the packet pushers Slack and other places on the internet, of course. And one of the interesting things was an article or a mention of Microsoft kind of blaming the EU. And I was like, well, okay, that sounds interesting. So I started digging into that. I forget things that don't directly impact my life long term. But a long time ago, like over 10 years ago, one of the EU organizations that regulates things the way that we have similar for trade here in the US basically told Microsoft, hey, you can't, because you have your own security solution and your own browser and your own this and your own that, it would be anti-competitive for you to have an advantage into your own operating system and kick everybody else out. And apparently that is really like the meat behind why does Windows uniquely allow this interaction at the kernel level, whereas, Apple is immune to this.
Right. Yeah, I did see some articles saying that this is the kind of update that should have happened in user space and not in the kernel. But yes, that is Microsoft's stance, that the EU made us open up the kernel to third parties, and we can't necessarily vet what third parties are doing. And so that does open the door for potential issues like this. I sort of guess that's a fair point, but it's also definitely Microsoft wanting to shift any blame away from, one, their anti-competitive positions in the past, two, their abysmal record of developing stable, secure software. Yeah, it does also seem like some blame shifting.
Yeah. So apparently there are options to interoperate through APIs with operating systems. I'm making kind of like a generic statement here, and I think that's how Apple does it. But I think it's interesting. So, I mean, one of the reasons, we pick the news stories or the topics that we do, it's not necessarily about like what's happening in this moment. I mean, this is definitely an in this moment thing, but it's because we want ourselves and you guys to kind of think through what might this mean in the future? How might this impact technology and security and how we're doing things? And I think this is going to shake some stuff. So, we're laughing about like the worldwide outage and big impact. Some of the things I heard was this, this particular issue with CrowdStrike and Microsoft crashing so many airlines, at least in the United States. Apparently, this was the biggest impact on air travel and flights since 9/11.
Wow.
Pretty major. Because we've had, I don't know, you guys listening in other countries, you might not know this. We can't really get transportation right here. I don't know, trains, airplanes, like our flight systems run on stuff. It's like still using punch cards and they haven't updated. So we've had a lot of, I would say, tech related disruptions, not due to malicious actors, just due to bugs or system failures over the past several years. But this one takes the cake.
It does, yeah. Being compared to a 9/11 effect is not something you want for CrowdStrike or Microsoft.
Not a good look. Yeah, I feel bad for George in this situation. That's their CEO. On the other hand, I'm still just really struggling to understand. And again, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I just can't figure out how this wasn't tested somehow or some way before it just completely blue screened this many machines. But I'm sure we will be finding out in the coming weeks what happened there. And I think George was actually the CTO. So McAfee had a similar incident maybe 10 years ago or so. And I think George was there as a CTO at that time too. So
what a record.
Not something you want to be known for.
The Forrest Gump of global outages. He's everywhere.
This reminds me of, sorry, you guys, my brain is in a constant like song lyrics mode. Okay. In the Phantom of the Opera.
Okay, we're getting classy here.
There's like a scene where the Phantom that goes, like chandelier comes crashing down and almost kills the main opera singer in this. And somebody's like, well, these things do happen. And she's like, well, this thing cannot happen. Like this cannot happen. You can't just brick 8 million machines because somebody forgot to test something. But all right, let's not beat that horse. Something else happened with Microsoft, unrelated to CrowdStrike, around the same time. And I think Microsoft kind of used this opportunity to just quietly, go, hey, everybody, look over here at the CrowdStrike thing.
Yeah, so on July 18th, and this was a day before the CrowdStrike outage, Azure reported issues, including the inability to access multiple services, and this was affecting users in the central U.S. region. I read some reporting by the Register. The U.S. central region has 3 availability zones, which is supposed to provide some resiliency, but all 3 AZs were unavailable. Microsoft 365, that includes widely used business applications like SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, also experienced disruptions. Neither the Azure nor Microsoft 365 problem seems related to the CrowdStrike updates. This was essentially a separate issue, and I found a Microsoft sort of after action report or preliminary post-incident review, and they said essentially there's address information for a number of VM hosts wasn't included in a regular allow list update to some backend storage. So when these VMs started sending disk requests to those storage systems, the requests were rejected because the address ranges of those VMs weren't on the allow list. So obviously the whole system, again, just failed because of that mistake.
And thanks to Drew for finding the links, because I had heard reference to this and I had a really hard time. All of the Microsoft links that supposedly had the information related to this incident had conveniently rolled off, after a 24, 48-hour period. So thanks for digging that up. I did, after you sent the link, check that out. The language here was interesting to me because it said the address information, which makes me think they're doing access control lists with actual, IP addresses or ranges versus some other identifiable information. So whether it's IPv4 or v6, I don't think it matters. But that was kind of interesting to me because I would expect in the world of zero trust architectures and technologies, especially Microsoft, would be doing something a little bit more sophisticated, like keying off of certificate information or something to uniquely identify the device, virtual or physical, whatever it may be, versus the IP space it's coming from. So that's another interesting kind of choice of words and way that they've described that. And I might be totally off base here, but that caught my attention in the after action report.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's because, VMs can be ephemeral, that identifying them by an IP address range made more sense at the time the system was designed, and maybe Microsoft will now be going back and looking at other options.
Yeah. Well, but I would assume, like, if you're using a certificate tied to it, that's going to move around with the device wherever it goes, which is, I would guess, would be more reliable than an IP address. But again, not a cloud security expert. Maybe we'll have a guest or Rich back on at some point and explain to us how this kind of stuff happens and how these things are managed. But yeah, so somebody forgot to update an allow list or ACL and took out a chunk of the US Azure service, which was also serving 365.
Yeah, it's interesting because speaking about resiliency, one of the sort of design practices when you're using cloud services is to, at the very least, make sure you've got resources in multiple availability zones, because if one goes down, the others are supposed to be able to essentially fail over and pick up the slack. But if all three AZs go down, you're kind of stuck unless you're also doing, across multiple regions.
Yeah, that whole thing is just cracking me up. And, the impact on me during the whole CrowdStrike blue screen combo Azure 365 issue was pretty minimal. I think like the biggest impact I had was I went into the gym early that morning and the person working at the front desk, said, we're not scanning people in because Microsoft is down. And later, so I'm working on a project where I'm doing some video content for a customer, and all of, my stuff is in the Microsoft cloud. So unlike us here where we're using Google right now, my PowerPoint's there, my Word documents there, all of my stuff is there. And I did have some situations and sometimes throughout Friday and the weekend where just weird things weren't working. Like I would try to bold something or move something or update a file or save it as, and it was just not working, or it would take 5 or 6 attempts at clicking on something to work. But otherwise, pretty smooth sailing through the weekend for me.
That's good. Yeah, I wasn't affected at all. Again, I'm on Mac, so I guess I get to be smug.
Lots of Mac loading going on.
That's right. Once again, Mac and Linux.
I do have to share this though. I think my biggest impact through all of this was, you guys can't see the project I'm working on. A lot of the slides, because it's like a security thing, a lot of the slides have that kind of lime green on them. And I was like, oh, I'm going to be cute. And when I go do my nails, I'm going to do them lime green, and then I'm going to match the slides. And oh my God, isn't that awesome? And JD, my partner, has a whole studio set up in his office, and that's where we've been recording things. And bless his heart, he's been so patient. So I sit down to do this next video, and feeling all cute with my new manicure, and he just looks at me like I have eaten a crayon. And he's like, Jen, you painted your nails green and we're using a green screen. Like,
so much for matching.
Awesome effects are about to happen here. Anyway,
That's right.
I digress.
Where did JJ's fingers go?
Back to resilience. Yeah, I'm definitely spirit fingers happening in this video now. It was a little bit of a thing though, because I'm supposed to be holding up certain things to the video camera. Anyway, so resilience.
Yes, back to resilience and perfect timing for CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Organization. 2 days before the CrowdStrike Windows fiasco began to roll out, CISA released the Infrastructure Resilience Planning Framework Playbook. This playbook is a companion to a previously released Infrastructure Resilience Planning Framework, which overall is a guide to help government agencies, private organizations, and businesses identify critical infrastructure, including IT, to identify threats and develop resiliency plans. So, like 2 days before this disaster happens, CISA puts out this playbook. And I was like, oh, wow, weird coincidence. But I thought, okay, resiliency is probably on people's minds. Maybe there's some stuff in here. So I wanted to look at it and dig into it a little bit and see if there's value here. The playbook basically describes 5 major steps. They're broken down into multiple phases. Each of the steps, they include things like organizing a planning group, identifying and prioritizing critical infrastructure and their dependencies, assessing risk, developing action plans, and taking action and evaluating effectiveness.
I just got completely distracted. I was totally listening to you, but I'm reading the quote here on CIS's site, and in bold, it had Dr. David Messington's name. And I was like, oh, I had to click on that because I served on a board with him a few years ago, and I forgot he had been appointed to this. So congratulations on that. Anyway, yes, I think in IT, we've tend to think about resilience in terms of like backup and disaster recovery and those strategies. But, these playbooks, and there's another one from, it's called the Operational Resilience Framework from the Global Resilience Federation. Those of you following along at RSA this year, a colleague and I, Alex, presented some information on operational resilience and how to use these frameworks. So lots of, similar and overlapping stuff here. I think, CIS's is tuned a lot for critical infrastructure, whereas the ORF framework is kind of for anybody and everybody. But there's just so many other pieces to this outside of just what we tend to think of with backup and disaster recovery. Because if we contextualize this for tech and InfoSec, you're plugging into what you're doing in support of what the business needs are. What that really boils down to is having a really clear understanding from the top down about not just what the business does, but how. And at least the ORF framework, and I'm sure CISA is focused on the same thing, which is how do we operate as efficiently as possible in an impaired state? It's not about necessarily 100%, 5-9 kind of uptime thing. It's when we are impacted, because something's going to happen, right? And the CISA document talks about tornadoes and tsunamis and earthquakes, and there's no avoiding that. So then it's, when something happens, whether it's a malicious attack or active nature or anything in between, how do we plan to minimize the impact of that?
Yeah. So do you see a difference between resiliency planning and, disaster recovery, business continuity planning, or are they like cousins?
Yeah, I think they're cousins, and I think backup and DR is a component of resilience planning, but I think resilience planning goes further. And so I think, a couple of great examples are, looking at like the Colonial Pipeline example. We'll drop the links in the show notes here. But if you go to the Operational Resilience Framework site, and CISA will have examples too, but you'll see like Acme Pipeline is one of the examples.
Not too subtle.
Intense. But, Colonial Pipeline was a big deal. And we talked about that in a news story before, but it is one of those things that will fundamentally change how we do things moving forward and where our priorities are. And so in the example, it's understanding the different business functions.
Mhm.
So that's everything that might be outside of IT directly, because it's in the case of like a pipeline, delivering and getting the product where it needs to go, all of the billing and accounting, because remember that Colonial Pipeline wasn't an OT attack. It was actually an attack on the IT system. But because they couldn't track and do billing, they ceased, pumping oil. And then you've got all of your internal functions like, payroll and making sure your employees are taken care of. And then you've got, the different customers. And in the pipeline example, you've got airplanes, consumer gas stations, commercial gas stations for public transportation, buses, et cetera. We had issues here when COVID happened. Everybody was homeschooling. They had just gone back to school where I live. And it feels like it was a few days. It was probably a few weeks. And then the buses stopped and they had to go back home because we didn't have gas.
Right. There was no diesel, yeah.
Yeah. So you look at your customer groups and you figure out who's the priority here. And the priority is for CISA, national security and safety, but also with critical infrastructure. Part of that is just about not invoking or evoking panic.
Mhm.
So, like in the pipeline example, it could be, okay, well, all of emergency response and local government, they need the gas supply. Airports actually have a stockpile, and a lot of air travel is more leisure than anything else. If it's that critical, we've got, private planes, jets, Department of Defense assets, if it's something like that. And then consumer gas stations might be, well, if consumers can't get gas, they can't get to work, the grocery stores can't open,
Right.
food supply is an issue, widespread panic, people lined up for miles at gas station, no gas, blah, blah, blah. You start to prioritize them based on that. So long-winded answer for then it's how do you architect all of the IT and security systems in support of the priorities as they relate to internal functions like HR and billing and payables and servicing the customers. What that might mean is, backup and recovery strategy for critical systems, but it's understanding which systems are critical in which context, and then
Right.
also having plans for maybe it means you're going to work with a partner or even a competitor, especially when critical infrastructure is at stake, because this is not a competitive situation at that point.
Right. So I'm curious, looking through the playbook, it's very process centric. There's a lot of like identify stakeholders, have a meeting, write a statement of purpose, get champions, identify your dependencies. So lots of documentation, lots of process, and that's essential, but it's also the kind of thing that just feels like, oh God, more meetings. And then you have a document at the end, and then you all congratulate yourselves for writing the document, and that goes on a shelf. How do you make sure that if you're going to go through all the effort of building a resiliency plan, that you can operationalize it as opposed to just shelve it?
Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides end-to-end lifecycle protection for cloud-native application environments. It empowers organizations to safeguard their APIs, serverless functions, containers, and Kubernetes environments. Panoptica ensures comprehensive cloud security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, offering deep visibility, contextual risk assessments, and actionable remediation insights for all your cloud assets. Powered by graph-based technology, Panoptica's attack path engine prioritizes and offers dynamic remediation for vulnerable attack vectors, helping security teams quickly identify and remediate potential risks across cloud infrastructures. Panoptica utilizes advanced attack path analysis, root cause analysis, and dynamic remediation techniques to reveal potential risks from an attacker's viewpoint. Visit panoptica.app to learn more.
I think now I'm not a huge fan of like long government documents and long playbooks and things like that. Let me just get that out there. However, I am a fan of documentation. And I know this is the D word that every engineer hates to hear.
Everybody just clicked away from the rest of the episode.
Document your stuff, people. But the truth is that I think, starting off with that gives you two huge benefits, maybe three. First, I mean, you guys know this. If you get all gung ho and like this is the shiny object right now, but it's your shiny object, and then the next shiny object comes or the next priority comes or whatever, or you leave, that just drops. And I think what CISA is saying is this is so critical. And the ORF framework says the same thing. You need to make sure that it's sustainable programmatically in your organization. And that means put a team together, make sure it's not somebody's pet project, get consensus on what this means and how it's going to be funded, how it's going to be executed, what the timeline is for it. And then all of that, documentation and paperwork and planning, if you sit down and you figure out and you plan everything up front, it's much, much, much more easy to execute it and then divvy things up and then just go forth and conquer without having to constantly revisit, check in, and adjust plans. Now, obviously, with anything like this, you're going to have tweaks and adjustments and course correction. But if you can start with a template of what you need to do and get everybody on the same page and have a team to do it, you are far more likely to be successful.
So I'm thinking resiliency in this case, maybe you're thinking about, okay, let's maybe start testing patches before they deploy, or let's stagger our updates. We'll, send some updates to sort of non-critical or semi-critical systems first and see what happens. Things like that, maybe being less reliant on one operating system or something like, getting away from the monoculture. But when you're building out resiliency planning, how do you avoid sort of falling into the trap of planning for the last war and everything you planned was on something that may not happen again?
So you're saying like, how do you not over plan for a one-off?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there are lots of models. I mean, I think even, looking at the CISA playbook, it kind of walks and talks through what could happen. There's definitely data and gut checks behind the probability of certain things happening. When we talk about enterprise risk management, we have formulas for calculating, risk as it relates to security. There's formulas for calculating risk as it relates to financial considerations. Like, we have these models, we have the math. It's not perfect, but we can leverage that to understand that this might not be a one-off. And certainly when we're talking about malicious actors, acts of nature or acts of God, with things like, hurricanes, tsunamis, tornadoes, those things are going to happen.
Right.
They're going to happen. I don't
Right.
think anybody disputes that. And so it does, I think, make sense to go through the exercise of understanding what those scenarios are, which are most probable and which are maybe less probable but most impactful if something happens.
Mhm.
Let me piggyback on that, because I think one, great example of planning for the last war, as it might be, is if we look at the TSA and airline screening here in the US.
Exactly. Taking off my shoes because somebody tried to build a shoe bomb once.
Yeah, I mean, and when we had the Boston Marathon attack where they used a pressure cooker,
Right.
Every store in the US stopped selling pressure cookers for a few weeks.
Right.
In hindsight, that sounds really ridiculous. Well, it sounded ridiculous to me at the time, but it was what people decided to do because they were just frozen. They didn't know what to do. So having a plan and going, okay, this is a one-off. We're not going to respond to it the same way that we would as something that might be more than a one-off, right?
Yeah, I think that's my point, is that you don't want to build your resiliency planning around, I guess, a specific incident. Like, okay, the plan is we're just going to pull all the pressure cookers off the shelves next time. But how useful is that plan?
Yeah.
All right. So I guess it's more about like thinking about broader categories as opposed to specific incidents when you're building a resiliency plan, like natural disaster, IT outage, terrorist attack, et cetera, as opposed to the specificity of each of those things.
Yeah. Now, and here's a great way to prove that point. So one of my friends actually, in their risk or threat modeling before COVID, one of the things that they modeled, because they just came up with crazy stuff, was a zombie apocalypse.
Nice.
True story. They used zombie apocalypse to model out their response and planning. And that plan is what they executed during COVID, because it basically happened. Zombies are out in the street. They'll eat your brains. You can't leave your house. Supply chain is impacted. Workforce is impacted. People are sick and dying. I mean, it's hilarious, but it's almost exactly what happened through COVID. You don't have to go, oh, okay, well, what if, a nation state attacker group hit this particular asset while there is an earthquake in California? And, you don't have to run through every single, scenario like that and probability like you would a Monte Carlo table in your head or something. But just to understand, okay, this is offline, doesn't matter why. I can't leave my house, doesn't matter why, right? You can threat model around those things.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and we'll have links in the show notes to the CISA and the ORF frameworks if you are thinking about resiliency and maybe want to get something going in your organization. Moving on, and sort of again with our theme, Microsoft has announced changes to its update process to make its update packages smaller and more efficient to download and distribute. It's going to start with Windows 11 version 24H2, I think, which is coming out later this year. Microsoft is going to release what it calls checkpoint cumulative updates. Microsoft says these checkpoint updates will be, quote, smaller incremental differentials containing only the changes since the previous checkpoint cumulative update, end quote. I guess in the past, Microsoft would sort of add new updates to the previous update, so that update file just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger with each update. Now they're breaking it out into smaller pieces that should be more digestible and more efficient to distribute to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of devices.
I'm embarrassed to say this, but I thought that's what they were already doing, because to me, that's what would have made sense.
Okay.
I have no further comment, Your Honor.
That's fine. We can leave it there. There's links in the show notes.
I was reading it going, you're doing what now?
Yeah, I didn't know that's how they did it myself. I assumed it was incremental. And just to note, this new approach, this new model of the incremental updates is going to apply to Windows 2025 servers as well. It doesn't apply to Windows 10 or earlier versions. I do think the one thing is that it could make management and tracking efforts by administrators a little more complicated as they figure out which devices have gotten or haven't gotten which differential updates. But hopefully Microsoft will also be putting systems in place to help you with that tracking.
One would think, one would hope, right?
Fingers crossed.
Now, I'm a Windows user and an Android kind of gal versus an Apple user, but I'm sorry, this is a little bit funny. And I just have this picture of like Windows with the cane, catching up to Apple. I'm gonna catch up to you, you little Apple youngins. I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna get my patches done right. Yep, yes, sir. I'm gonna do some security. No, that's not the picture you had in your head.
Not the picture I had in my head, but it's there now. So thank you. All right, we're going to wrap up with, I guess, I don't know if this quite fits the theme, but it's funny and interesting and kind of revisit something that we've talked about in the past. We had mentioned in a previous episode, we talked about sort of like these essentially laptop farms where folks in the US would essentially pretend to be employees at a company and set up a bunch of laptops, and then those laptops would actually be farmed out via VPNs to people from North Korea or China who would then work for the companies to either earn a salary or do kinds of infiltration and stuff. So the latest episode of this is security awareness training company KnowBe4 was tricked into hiring a North Korean worker. The company says it quickly realized it had been tricked when their SOC team detected malicious activity on the employee's freshly issued laptop. There was a short investigation of the activity, and there were some unsuccessful attempts to get the new employee onto a call, so the SOC team just contained the new employee's device. The company says during the hiring process, it conducted interviews, it performed background checks, and it verified references before hiring the person. But the company believes the would-be employee used a stolen identity and what they call an AI-enhanced photo to slip through the vetting process.
This was wild. I saw this posted from one of my friends that works at KnowBe4. And if you're not familiar with KnowBe4, they are a security company. They make user awareness training and phishing simulations and other stuff along that vein. They are really truly focused on security. And I think in this, they said that our HR team conducted 4 video conference based interviews on separate occasions, confirming the individual matched the photo, blah, blah, blah. I mean, they background check references, video conference interviews. This is a lot of work and a lot of hoops that somebody jumped through. And I think the message, here for everybody is if it can happen to a security company who's that diligent about their hiring processes, it really could happen to anybody. And the kicker is that these people are actually also doing the work. Now, this particular situation, this all just kind of went down in the past less than 10 days at the time we're recording this. So when you're listening to this, you're talking about maybe 2 weeks old at the most, so still developing. But, they're actually doing the work they're hired to do. So, it's not like they're hiring somebody and then that person's just ghosting and being unresponsive and red flags are being triggered. Now, in this case, it sounds like
this North Korean person they hired immediately tried to start downloading malware onto the corporate device and also trying to do nefarious things in the system. So they didn't even wait to sort of build up any kind of trust profile. They just immediately started going hard at them, which I guess the company's EDR software on the laptop was like, whoa, wait, what's going on? And the SOC team saw those alarms and got to work.
Yeah. So this was a Mac OS device, but they being KnowBe4 had absolutely fantastic, monitoring and security controls in place. So, the fact that they caught this literally within minutes of it starting is absolutely fantastic. There's a blog linked in the show notes at KnowBe4, and I think some great takeaways here. They did a little bit of a postmortem on it. So they've got, tips to prevent this and recommended process improvements and what to look for. So things like the way these little farms work is the laptop, when somebody's, I'm air quoting, hired, their laptop gets sent to an address that's, presumably here in the US, somewhere expected.
Mhm.
It's obviously not where this person lives because this person lives in North Korea. So it's sent to this farm where a system and a business around supporting this type of scam. And then the worker, who again is a legitimate professional in this area, remotes into that device. So one of their, tips is, making sure that nobody is remoting into that device,
Mhm.
Using a VPN or some other type of tool. And then, triggering on that shipping address for the laptop not being the home address that's listed for that person, maybe a little bit harder to vet if it happens to be the same address for both things. Anything else that caught your attention on that?
I don't want to, dump on KnowBe4 because I appreciate the fact that they're putting out, how this happened to them and what they did. But I feel like they're also trying to put themselves in the best light. And this may be more about HR processes in general, but things like, background checking and checking references. My wife just went through a job change and she had to go through this. And the checking references part seemed like highly automated, meaning like there were no humans in the loop really. Like it wasn't like in the old days where somebody would make a phone call and get on the phone and talk to the person and say, and find out some information about it. It's more like let's go look them up on LinkedIn, and yep, you worked there, and yep, you may have known this person. And so it seems like the background vetting process or reference checking needs to be a little bit more consistent. They also said in their blog post that names used were not consistent across the various background checks. Don't rely on email references only, right? So I think there are ways to bolster your HR processes to make sure that you are actually talking to people and not just going through automated systems.
Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate about the one thing with the references, and I think they did use email to exchange to get references. So with ISC, now called ISC2, and other certifications that are accredited, like if somebody's getting their CISSP or another certification, one of the things is you have to get an endorsement from an existing member because the existing members have taken code of ethics, et cetera. And so your job, if you're an endorser, and it's one of the reasons why I don't do this unless I actually know the person and have known the person for a long time. One of the things you have to do as an endorser is a lot like an HR reference check. So it's your job as the endorser and the current member to verify their work history and their responsibilities and tasks at those jobs is in alignment with the current requirements for that certification.
Yes.
And let me tell you, getting people on the flipping phone to have a conversation
yes, it's hard.
Is dang near impossible. So just playing devil's advocate, I totally get how, I think the fact that they even got email references, so that shows you how elaborate that this kind of net is.
Yes.
When it comes to things like name mismatches, in the US and in parts of Europe, I think we're pretty spoiled with, we tend to have, a first name, a given name and a family name, maybe a middle name in there somewhere. In other parts of the world, and especially, Asia and Latin America, it's not that straightforward, and it can get pretty confusing as to what's a middle name, what's a last name, what's your mother's last name versus your. So I totally get, especially, dealing with certain parts of the world where maybe name mismatches don't trigger the same way that they would
for Western names. Yeah, that's true.
Now, the other thing to look for that I thought was really awesome here was the use of voice over IP numbers for phone numbers. That was another one I thought, yeah, that's a great way to kind of trigger on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good advice from KnowBe4, I think. And again, appreciate the fact that they did get stung. They managed to clean it up very quickly, and now they're sharing their learnings. That's always appreciated. So links in the show notes.
Yeah. And I hope you enjoyed your news dessert, as Drew called it, the palate cleanser after the heavier resilience conversation.
That does wrap up this episode. Thank you for listening. Again, if you have comments, clarifications, corrections, you can always hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. If you want to talk to us not in person, but online, we're both on LinkedIn. There's also a Slack community at Packet Pushers you can come check out. That's at packetpushers.net/community. Again, thank you for the great download numbers in June. We hope to see it again in July. Thank you for listening, and stay safe.